Yesterday marked the 10th straight night of protests in Ferguson, Missouri, over the police shooting of unarmed African-American teenager Michael Brown. The night was largely peaceful, with the exception of a few bottles being thrown at law enforcement. And although cops did end up arresting more than 40 people by the end of the night, there were no reports of tear gas or smoke bombs being used. And today, a grand jury began to hear evidence concerning the killing of Michael Brown and will decide whether or not to indict Officer Darren Wilson in the coming days and months. Meanwhile, controversy abounds over the lead prosecutor investigating the shooting, Robert McCullough, because several of his close family members worked for the St. Louis Police Department. Furthermore, his police officer father was killed in the line of duty when he was a child, raising serious questions about his objectivity when it comes to Brown's case. However, Missouri Governor Jay Nixon has refused to remove McCullough, calling for a vigorous prosecution. So to discuss these developments, I'm joined now by Mike Papantonio, attorney, co-host of the Ring of Fire radio show. Always amazing to have you on, Mike.
Abby, how are you?
I'm doing well. Mike, I have to tell you, now this is odd. I was watching a live stream of Ferguson last night, and it appeared that journalists actually far outnumbered protesters. I mean, do you think the enormous amount of reporters on the ground is actually exacerbating the situation purely for the purpose of keeping the story alive?
Well, we've seen that is the way of the world with journalism nowadays, and that certainly seems to be the case here. But I think there's some good reporting coming out of here. I think, first of all, had you not had this type of reporting, the U.S. Justice Department wouldn't have made the move that they've made. Here you have Holder seeing the same things we've all observed from different angles of the camera. They're all interested in the same stories. As you point out, there's so many moving parts. Bob McCullough, the prosecutor, has been asked to investigate this homicide this man has such incredibly strong ties. His uncle, his mother, his brother, his cousin, his father worked for the Ferguson Police Department. Add to that the fact, as you point out, Jay Nixon incredibly seems to be good with that, will not replace McCullough. Here's the problem when that happens. Here's the stories that those reporters that you're talking about need to be reporting about. You need to have a prosecutor unconnected with this Ferguson community. You need to have a grand jury unconnected with what's going on there. This prosecutor is going to have the ability, if you really think about what the downside is, and I hope the media will cover this, the prosecutor is going to have the ability to heavily load and manipulate his presentation of evidence to this grand jury without that grand jury ever understanding what's happening. It's the prosecutor in a room with the grand jury, nobody giving all the sides of this. If this prosecutor feels like Officer Wilson is on his way to a second-degree murder charge, well, what does he do? He tweaks that presentation with a witness or very selective forensic evidence that reduces that possibility. Worse yet, let's imagine the grand jury does indict. All along the way, the presentation of the trial, anyone with the slightest bit of cynicism is wondering whether McCullough is really nothing more than a Trojan horse passively or actively working to undermine the case. And those would be real world concerns, Abby.
Yeah, indeed. And I'm glad you just brought up all of that. I wanted to talk about this jury as far as Wilson's possible arrest. It might take up to 2 months until a grand jury decides whether there's enough evidence to indict him. I wanted you to talk about why this process is so complicated, seemingly. And if it does go to court, how much damage do you think the media repeatedly playing the robbery footage of Michael Brown will impact the jury?
Well, it always impacts the jury. Unfortunately, I have a different take on this case, Abby. It's a little different from what most people are talking about right now, because I have been a prosecutor, I've been a criminal defense lawyer, but main thing is I've always been a trial lawyer. The truth is that even the early stages in this case, an experienced criminal defense lawyer would tell you even right now that they look at this case and it's very winnable. Mark O'Mara, for example, a good friend of mine, handled the Zimmerman defense, was put in that situation, and he and I were talking about this case today. And here's the problems. These are the things that the journalists need to be very careful of when they report these issues. Proximity is something you're going to see the defense use. The closer you put Officer Wilson to a 6'4", 300-pound Michael Brown, who appears to be moving forward with his arms extended, the better chance the defense has to sell reasonable use of force, reasonable mistake, and panic. Now, to tie that into the journalism aspect of it, they have to understand that part of the story. They have to understand that this prosecutor needs to be, as he's presenting this information to the grand jury, these are all things that the grand jury is going to be thinking about. Or how about this, where you have the suggestion that Brown was in a hyper-agitated state of mind in the way that he dealt with the shopkeeper by shoving the shopkeeper around, that didn't just arise. That came out of, as you point out, that came out of the narrative that's out there with the journalists. This agitated state of mind argument for Brown completely helps the defense. Add to that the possibility of them finding blood spray patterns in the officer's patrol car that are consistent with Brown's DNA. Go a step further and put Brown's DNA on the officer's firearm. All of a sudden you have a very different case. That's why your point about how this is reported, what is the narrative that's created, all of these things can be tweaked just a little bit, and all of a sudden you have a jury that says, gee whiz, this poor officer just panicked, this poor officer was put in a situation where he didn't know what to do, so he started firing his gun. That is not manslaughter, that is not second-degree murder under the rules of law. So the way the journalists handle this, as you point out, are extremely important, because these are very fine line issues that all can be changed, very quickly.
Right. Thank you so much for breaking that down. Really, really fascinating there. And you're right, it is really important. One thing that I find particularly fascinating, Mike, is the way that the police are acting despite there being hundreds of cameras on them. I mean, countless journalists have been arrested over the course of these demonstrations. Pretty unprecedented. I mean, I was covering the Occupy Oakland protests, and they didn't treat media with this kind of contempt. I'd hate to see how they act when the cameras aren't on them, but I wanted to read you a quote from a Washington Post article entitled, "I'm a Cop. If you don't want to get hurt, don't challenge me," written by LAPD officer Sunil Duda. He writes, "If you don't want to get shot, tased, pepper sprayed, struck with a baton, or thrown to the ground, do what I tell you. Don't argue with me. Don't call me names. Don't tell me that I can't stop. Don't say I'm a racist pig. Don't threaten me that you'll sue me and take away my badge." Mike, as a lawyer, does a cop have the right to use force for any of those actions?
Well, this is the era of the ninja cop, so it's a moving target. Listen, you have these ninja cops, these particularly bad in the South. They're Dixieland stormtroopers. It would be a Barney Fife kind of situation that's almost laughable if it weren't so serious. But you've taken these undertrained police officers, you've given them shock wave cannons, you've given them LRADs, LRAD sound shock cannons, you've given them taser drones, for God's sakes. The government has armed them to the T. And you know what? When you put that kind of material in somebody who's not prepared to handle it, they're not trained to handle it, all of a sudden the same thing happens that we see happen in Ferguson all over the country. Look, if you take a look at the MMPI of these characters, why is it that they all have shaved heads? They have the Bruce Willis goatee. They have guns strapped over every appendage of their body, because they become what they think about. And what we have done is we have empowered all that by giving them tanks, by giving them helicopters, by giving them AK-47s. The federal government is just as responsible in this because of their 1033 program that we pump billions of dollars in to arm these Dixieland stormtroopers heavily along the southern coast of this United States. I mean,
I wanted to jump in here really quick because we have about a minute left, but in your mind, Mike, what measures need to be taken to address this community's grievances?
Well, we need to return to the idea of the policemen having a connection to the community where they're not occupiers, but they have a connection. They care about the community. The community cares about them. They don't dress up like ninja cops. They dress up more like Andy of Mayberry. They can still carry a gun, they can still be effective, they can still protect themselves, but it's the whole mentality that has got to be changed. It's all post 9/11. Bush put a huge amount of dollars into these programs to arm them to the teeth, and now we're seeing the result of it, and it's very, very ugly, unfortunately. It's not just Ferguson, by the way. It's happening all over the South right now.
It is indeed, and I couldn't agree more with that assessment. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure to have you on. Mike Papantonio, co-host of Ring of Fire Radio.